Hey, everybody. Welcome to Change Chat. In this edition, we are going to be talking to my friend Brandon Boswell. And for those of you who don't already know Brandon, I know a lot of you on this channel may know him already, but I'm going to let him introduce himself here in a minute. I think it's always better to have people introduce themselves than me try to do it and get something wrong. But really interested, Brandon has a new, I don't know if I'd even call it a product. I'd call it a system, but you can correct me on that if I'm wrong. And I was looking at your website a little bit, and you said it's actually a methodology, and I like the way you phrased that. But he has a playlist. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brandon, let him introduce himself a little bit, tell us a little bit about his background, and then we're just going to have a conversation today and talk a little bit about organization and planning and what that kind of looks like, especially with all the new technologies that seem to keep popping up everywhere you look. So, Brandon, welcome. It's great to have you as always, and great to talk to you and catch up. But tell everybody a little bit about yourself and maybe what led to this moment, where playlists kind of came from and why now, and a little bit more about it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Ed. It's always great when we get to catch up. I feel like we've been having these chats offline for years now, and we finally get to do this one online, which is cool. Yeah, so my name is Brandon Boswell. I guess I would call myself a product designer by trade. I've always been in software and design of software and engineering. My historical day job is in obstetrics, where I help build software that helps doctors deliver healthier babies. And then about 2 years ago, I had this idea for a focus planner. And I was like, you know what? This is an interesting idea. And then I convinced myself that it wasn't the right time. And I put it down for a little bit. And then it just kept coming back to me. And so eventually I came to the realization that I needed to finally build this thing, which is now Playlist, which again, I've been working on for a year and a half now. And it's finally starting to see light and finally get to talk about it, which is nice. So yeah, so Ed, you asked kind of like, what is it and how would I describe it? Playlist is a methodology, and then it's a piece of software that kind of reinforces that methodology. I think it's kind of wild that every planning tool or to-do list asks you to bring your own methodology, which I think is interesting. I love the flexibility of that, but I don't know that everyone should be building their own methodology. I don't think it's productive for everyone to read 3 productivity books, come up with their own methodology for how they want to manage their own productivity, and then try to put it into a piece of software that doesn't actually know their methodology and doesn't reinforce any of those things. And so you have to first figure out what the right thing is. You then have to figure out how to implement it. And then you have to have the wherewithal and the motivation and fortitude to maintain that over a long period of time. And so my thought process behind Playlist was, what if the software and the methodology knew about each other? And for the handful of people that was a really great fit, it'll be like a marriage made in heaven. And for those that it wasn't a great fit, there's 1,000 other productivity tools for them to use instead. And so I came to this realization that, all right, now it's time to finally go build this thing. And then it took far too long to build, but it's finally here and I'm excited to share it with folks.
Yeah, and I want to pull on a thread on that because I think that, one of the big things that when I started out, I wanted to talk a lot about organization. Now, e-ink derailed that a little bit with me, and I'd talk a lot about that, but I still, at my core, and mostly what I focus on this channel is organization, getting yourself organized, having access to the information you need when you need it, that kind of a thing. And it got me thinking the other day because I remember you and I, like you said, we've talked offline for years now about this. And I remember when you started developing this, and I still have, a little bit of access to the beta. And so for me, it's different than how I think, but it challenges me to think. And I've become to really wonder, and this is a question that I'm going to throw back to you and kind of see if we can kind of flesh this out together for the audience, but is planning different than organization? And because, and this is just my quick take, and I want to hear your thoughts specifically on this. Organizationally, I can find anything I need anytime I want it. It's not difficult for me between my tablets and between Obsidian. I'm a pretty organized guy. Planning feels different. It feels like that's actually taking action on the information that you have. That's kind of the buckets I put them in, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that and kind of how playlists would, a better word, play into that. What would be the reasoning behind that?
I have some really strong opinions about this. I think, one, I think Playlist is a tool that sits alongside your organizational tools. So it doesn't replace Obsidian, for example. I think of to-do lists and calendars as these ephemeral tools. My goal is to get information in and out of them as quickly as possible. Whereas I think of Obsidian as more of a long-term resting place of content. So the quality of the thing that I'm keeping is going to be higher in Obsidian versus in a planning tool or a to-do list or a calendar. My goal is, what is the minimum amount of information to get me to the right mindset of what I'm trying to do? And then I think of that content more as throwaway. So like, I'm not putting these artifacts that I want to maintain long term in there because I'll never be able to find them when I want to find them. What I would rather do is instead link to something in Obsidian or in Notion or in this content repository that we're going to maintain. And then this is just a pointer to that thing. So that's thought number one. The other thing that I hope to solve with Playlist is, if you think about like an Eisenhower matrix, we talk about like importance and urgency. And I think that's good. I think it's like a good starting point to think about these things. But a lot of the most rewarding and impactful things that we do are in this important but not urgent bucket. Any like significantly meaningful thing, starting a YouTube channel, like writing a book, starting an app, starting a book club, none of those things are, but they can be deeply rewarding if you can finally convince yourself to commit to it, get started, and maintain. And so what I wanted to do with Playlists is have this thought process that there's actually maybe only 1 to 3 ultra important strategic things that you need to do each week. Yet we find tons and tons of things to fill our week with that are maybe not strategically important, but are just urgent. And I wanted to push back on that a little bit and have this thought process that at the beginning of the week, I'm going to pick 1 to 3 small but significant things that are completely within my control that I want to try to accomplish this week. And then at the end of the week, I'm going to look back at that list and hopefully I've completed those things and I can take satisfaction and say that this was a great week. And I've found in my life, if I do that for a long enough period of time, really cool outcomes happen that are kind of invisible otherwise. That's how I started a YouTube channel, is I decided I was going to make a video every 2 weeks and I was going to do that for a long enough period of time. And I would pivot as I learned things and tweak things ever so slightly. But it's that maintaining that over a long period of time that I think leads to really cool outcomes that a lot of people, they can't see the progress they're making. And so they give up before they actually achieve the things that they want to achieve.
Yeah, and I appreciate that thought because I've been around a while and I've been in business for a long time and used Basecamp. I've used Microsoft Project. I've used a million different project planning tools, and to me, Playlist feels different. And I'm not using it currently because I think, unless something's changed, so you can correct me here, it's still primarily Mac driven or iOS driven.
Yeah, we're only letting people on the Mac in right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So once it gets released full scale to Windows, you'll have a sign up for me because I really want to figure out what you just talked about. Because I think that people ask me, how did you work full time, finish your doctorate, all this other stuff, and I can't ever tell them. I tell them I kind of just took things as they came and whatever was in the moment, which is not the way to do it. I want to be very clear. At least I don't feel it's the way to do it. But they would say, oh, well, how did you do all of it? Well, I don't know. I just did it. Whatever was in front of me, I tackled and I gave it what I needed. And then I would get distracted and move to this other thing. But somehow they coalesced and I figured out how to get it done. I would not recommend that to most people, especially if you stress.
You're drinking from the fire hose, if you will, right?
All the time. And that's how I kind of feel. And even with some of these other tools, because I really appreciated your point about there are a million different tools out there and having the methodology fit. And I wondered if you could expand on one thing I've heard you say before. Playlist is a much more tailored experience in that you take the time to get to know the person as you onboard them. So if you could describe maybe that process a little bit and how you kind of bring somebody into it and have that conversation about why it would or maybe would not fit. But I'm just curious if you could expand kind of on
Yeah.
that.
So there's a couple threads that I want to pull there, and so bring me back if I go too far off track. But you've mentioned a lot of these tools like Basecamp, and I mentioned Notion and all these different things. And so we have a lot of tools for work, and we have some tools for home, but we don't really have a lot of tools that coalesce all the things together. And so one of the ideas behind Playlist is modern people have a lot of different things going on. They've got work, they've got personal things, they've got hobbies, they've got side projects, they've got errands to run their children to, and all of these things take up chunks of our week. And I like to think of that as our mix of things that we're doing, playing into the whole playlist theming. But this idea that like all of it comes out of our waking hour bucket, and we got to figure out what that mix of things is that we want to spend our time on, we want to spend our life on. And so what is that mix? Well, it's maybe this much work and this much family and this much like something for myself, or like, trying to get a new business going, or something that's self-fulfilling in some way. And I wanted to have a tool that brought together all the different things that you were spending your time on to show you what your real availability was and where you can put in those chunks of for me time or strategic things that I want to work to. Like, again, maybe you want to write a book or start a podcast or things like this. You maybe have a handful of hours each week that you could use for something like that, and identifying when that is and deciding how you're going to spend that time reliably. And so that's one piece. The other piece is, again, all of these are very like utility oriented things. You can kind of do anything you want in Notion. You can do anything you want in Basecamp. They don't have strong opinions on how it's used. With a calendar, if you're only looking at the calendar when you're planning, I think that's really great. But I wanted to create a tool that reinforced these habits that you're trying to build. So this idea that you've set aside this hour to write a script for a YouTube video, and there's like a million different things that can be vying for that attention. So how do you like try and block that out so that you increase your odds of actually making meaningful progress on that script versus scrolling Reddit or looking at YouTube comments? And so in playlists, there are these different modes of thinking. So you still have that very utility oriented view for planning. So for planning your week, the view looks very similar to a calendar that you're familiar with because that interface works great for the planning. But then you can flip into focus mode and then just see that one thing that you're supposed to be doing right now. It basically shows you your day, but instead of seeing your whole day, you just see the one thing that you've said that you intend to do right now. And then once you finish that, then you'll see your next thing. And so just trying to environmentally design an area for focus. And so you can switch to planning when you want to plan, but when you're finishing planning, we can then give you a different view that helps you actually do the thing that you set out to do, instead of showing you all of the hundreds of things that you want to get done this week and then have this paralysis of not being able to start on any given one of those things.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think respect a lot about your approach is this idea that you have multiple ways to engage with the information. Now, I want to tie together with something else you just said, which is about learning new habits and figuring out a way to be more focused, because I know that's my biggest problem. It always has been. It's that fire hydrant approach of, I'm productive because I'm organized enough to handle the stuff coming at me. And that's good in a lot of ways. And there are times when you need to be able to switch. You need to be able to pull on something that doesn't necessarily seem maybe tied to the task you're on, but it triggers, and now you need to go pull that information and incorporate it. But there are other times when you really, and I think this is from what I've seen a playlist, it does very well. Okay, I've said I need to get this thing done today. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, that it also has kind of a time tracking feature that allows you to say, okay, I spent this much time on this specific thing, or I've spent enough time on this for now. I need a break cognitively, whatever it is. And maybe I'll put this on hold for a minute and come back to it. And then you can still pick up where you left off and track. And I don't know who may use it that way, but as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking you build that muscle memory, you build that habit of, can I really go to focusing on one thing at a time and then make that viable for me? Or is there a way to kind of switch between the two or table something for a few minutes or maybe an hour and then come back to it? It seems like a highly adaptable system the way that you've configured
Yeah.
it.
So I think it's really challenging for people to build that habit. And so, like, I work in creative fields where you need to do this thing, but you don't necessarily know where to start. And because of that, like, so much of what I do is so bursty, like designing something new. You're starting from scratch. The goal is to get to flow state. And you don't know that you're going to get to flow state, but the only thing that you can do is craft your environment and craft your mindset. So we often think about crafting like our physical environment. Like if I want to focus, I need to go find a room. It needs to be quiet. I need to not have toys and phones and things that'll distract me. But we often like stop there, and our digital environment is still chaotic. We're still getting Slack messages, we're still getting email notifications, might have multiple windows going, and we can see all these things. And so what Playlist is trying to do is to help us like craft that digital environment. So like we can turn on focus mode when we press play on that task. And like that's the hardest part, right? Is getting started. And so those first like few minutes may feel fleeting. We may not know whether we're actually going to get meaningful stuff done, but it's about the getting started and that subtle commitment of pressing play on that task. And I'm committing to that's the one thing that I'm going to do right now. And there's like a little mental trigger of, okay, I can let go of the rest of this for this next 45 minutes. These next 45 minutes, even if I get nothing done, I'm just going to think about this thing. And I've found over time, after that first 5 minutes or so, things start rolling. And I don't want anything to like knock me out of that until I'm mentally done or like my next meeting starts. And so Playlist will also give you a notification that, okay, your next meeting starting in 3 minutes, kind of time to spin down on what we were working on. Will kind of nudge you out of that flow state that we're hopefully trying to get to.
And I relate this to my own personal experience, but also things that I've observed. And I find that I fill the time. So to your point, if I hit a roadblock, if I feel like I'm not making progress, my default is to switch to something that I
Mm-hmm.
know may be easier or I may be able to knock out quickly. And I like the intentional design of what you're talking about with playlists that kind of not forces you, but highly encourages you. And it kind
Mm-hmm.
of creates a structure around you to say, no, I'm focusing on this thing for 45 minutes. I'm focusing on this thing for an hour. Because I think as human beings, it's the same as like in a conversation, there are people, and I'm one of them, who try to fill the silence.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've learned over the years to let silence be uncomfortable, let it hang out there sometimes.
Cool things can happen there. Yes.
Because especially as I teach, because I actually had students comment that they liked that I would just not talk and wait for somebody to speak up. And I thought, man, that seems counterintuitive. It seems like it would feel boring or like it would feel like I'm not getting anything done. But what you just described there in playlist is the opposite. It's the way of thinking about it that in that silence, if you're stuck, if you're in the mindset of really trying to think through, how do I do this thing that I've deemed is really important.
Circling back to something you mentioned earlier about the like understanding the person and helping them craft their week. A big aspect of playlist is identifying when someone's high energy or creative time is of the day. So for many years, I thought I was a night person. I later learned I just wasn't getting enough sleep. And so my mornings were just wrecked from not getting good sleep. And so once I fixed my sleep, I learned that actually I'm most creative in the morning. And so if I want to do creative work, if I want to write scripts, for example, for YouTube, or I want to design things, what will come out will be significantly better in that high energy time. And so what Playlist is trying to do is to have you not fill your best time with those low energy tasks. So we want to take our administrative work, the things that we can do even if we're fried, and put those in our low energy time of the day and hold that high energy time or our best energy time for those tasks that align with it. So to give an example, if I use my morning answering emails and responding to Slack messages, and then I write my YouTube script or try to design something in the afternoon, it'll be very rote and uninteresting and very safe. Versus if I do that same task in the morning, it'll be way more interesting and way more creative. And so what Playlist is trying to help you do is to, although you want to respond to that email urgently, and although you want to respond to that Slack message urgently, if you do that, you're actually hurting yourself. Instead, we can hold time. For me, it's after lunch or towards the end of the day. I'll hold time in my calendar to work on those things and keep those big blocks of time in the morning to do the creative tasks. And I can defer those things like Slack messages and emails because I know I've held time for them and I know I'll get to them. And that allows my brain to switch and go, no, I don't need to go mess with that now. I've got time held for it that I'll get to in my low energy time.
Yeah, and I think this gets to kind of a broader conversation about expectation setting, I think, as well, because I have found over the years that if I reply immediately, or if I happen to be, because I teach at night online, if I happen to be online doing something and something work related comes in, since I'm connected everywhere, and I reply at 9 o'clock at night, it almost sets an expectation
Yes.
on the other side of that to where people feel that, well, Ed's going to be online all the time. So I should get an answer within, 10, 20, 30 minutes. And maybe I really don't have time or I'm not connected or I'm out of town. And so I appreciate that trying to figure out what you were just talking about of, what's really important? What are the things that I think are important versus the things that we may think are urgent
hmm
because of the tone of the email or whatever, but they're really not,
You're
and they can
volunteering
be
for a
done later.
job that you don't want. You become the like easy answer. I can, on more than the number of fingers I have, I can count the times where I've received a message that felt really urgent and I came back to it an hour later and it had solved itself. And that happens so often that you just become the easy answer instead of the right answer. And if it's truly important and it truly needs your skill set, that thing will still be there in an hour or 2 hours when you get to it. Now, this doesn't work for every position. If you're in sales, you got to be on call all the time. So like this is not like a perfect fit for every position, but if like creative and strategic thinking is valuable in your job, then I find that this methodology works really well.
Yeah, and I think just being able to get yourself in that mindset of, because I kinda straddle those things to where, some of the things I get are very much administrative, very much long term, or don't need an answer right away, and I am, at least I think I've gotten better over the years of, I almost never send something on the first draft anymore unless it's like super an easy answer, just because I wanna make sure that I send the right response. So I may draft
Yes.
something, let it sit for a little while, and then come back to it. But I do think that trying to figure out that balance, I also, in our office, in our center, we help faculty with the technology they teach with. So there are some things that are, my students can't access Canvas. Okay, that's everything gets dropped. We're on it. We're going to make that happen. But, oh, I need to figure out how to set up this one thing that I'm teaching, 2 semesters from now. I shouldn't be spending time that could be better focused somewhere else on that. It should be important and on my radar, but sometimes I can answer that right now. Gets in my own way. And to your
Well, that's
point,
the tricky thing is it doesn't seem like problematic. but you do it enough times and it actually just is derailing your strategic output, your high value, your high leverage output. And yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, and I do think that sets that expectation then. And then when someone needs you, I always joke that I've been working and I am nowhere near the guru on Canvas that some people say I am, but the Canvas learning management system. But I've been around since it was a scrappy startup and have worked with it for almost 16 years now. And I always joke with the faculty that if it gets to me, because I have designers and I have people who are very good at the system. If it gets to me, it's probably a problem that nobody else has seen. But I can also answer all those things that are easier. And sometimes I find myself wanting to jump into that and I've got to be like, no, I can't do that because there are other people that are in some ways better qualified because they handle those day-to-day routine things than I do. And yeah, you're right. It's such a hard mix. And that's one thing about playlists that I like is that it can kind of help you think about that ahead of time and triage in a way that, and again, it's no shade on any of those other programs, but I don't feel like they kind of have that way of being able to think ahead or think through
Yeah, the
what
higher
is
order.
important and when. Because it's
Yes.
all about order, but it's never about timing as much matching, I guess, is the best way for me to think about it. Matching when I need to do it versus just saying I need to do these things in this order.
Yep.
I don't know if that
So
makes sense or if that's coming across.
it totally does. So I have a story about this because this is actually like part of the origin of this is I've worked in startups for the last 12 years. And if anyone listening has worked in startups, something about startups is there's always an infinite amount of work to be done. And in my first startup, I drank from the fire hose. I did everything. I did as much as I could. I had a small child and I was just trying to do everything. And for startup number two, I took a slightly different approach. I realized that drinking from the fire hose didn't actually enable better output. It just enabled more output. And so I committed to being very on from the hours of 9 to 5:30 and very off unless the app is down or there's some like urgent thing like you were talking about with Canvas. Unless there's a genuine fire, I'm very out after 5:30. So 100% on in a specific working hours and then 100% off. That's sort of like me time, family time. And what this enabled me to do is to look at my week, figure out what I can get done in a week, and then see where the gaps were. And at that point, I knew my availability. I knew how much I had taken on. I knew where I was. And so when something new came in, our natural reaction is we want to be helpful. We want to say yes. We want to unburden the person who's bringing us some problem. Our first response is always that we want to say yes. And by using playlist and like earlier versions of this methodology, I learned whether I could actually say yes, whether I had room to throw this extra thing in, or I knew what else had to go out of my week if I did say yes. And so then when I'm chatting with folks, I can have a conversation with them about, is this thing more important than this other thing? And the answer was often no. But unless you can give them that trade off, of course they want this one thing. And it was when you could present that trade off that much more logical outcomes and much more logical discussions about priority and strategy come from this thing. Because when you're not giving anything up, of course I want that extra thing. But when you can present that argument, then we realize this thing maybe isn't as important as we thought it was when it was brought to us. And so I think it encourages a really healthy conversation that is important in so many lines of work.
Yeah, it reminds me of a personal story on my end too. When I had finished my master's, and I got really sage advice from mentors about whether I should start a doctoral program and what that entailed. And the first thing that I was told by two very close friends was, first thing you need to do is sit down and talk to your family because there are going to be real world ramifications of taking on that kind of a thing. And if your support structure, not We're not talking about school or academic. If your personal support structure is not there, you're not going to make it. So I thought that was really sage advice. And then when we started the program, someone said, you have to sit there, and it's the same thing you just said. Figure out, what are you going to give up? What are the sacrifices you're willing to make? Because you're not going to have time. And I said earlier that people asked me how I did it. Well, there were things that got lost in that. There were things I couldn't do because of all the things coming at me. And I think that process is really important, to think through, what are my core things that have to happen? What are the things that are most important to me? And not only can something be replaced, but could something maybe be just pushed back a little and then brought back, or that meaningful, purposeful thinking about just the universe of things we want to do versus the things that we need and we need to do.
Yeah, for everything that we're intentional about, we're intentionally giving up a lot of other things. Like, for instance, since I've been working on playlist, I've been giving up my YouTube channel in this process. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but like, I've posted 2 YouTube videos in the last year and a half. And like, there are days where that doesn't feel great. But I know that this is the best leverage for my time and like what I should be doing, even though it feels painful to like give up that thing in the short term.
I've noticed, because I love your content.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I mean, when I was first, we're gonna derail a little bit into YouTube and e-ink, but I started when I started figuring out what I needed. Again, need versus want. I had seen Remarkable that a friend of mine had, and I was like, man, I really love that technology. And then I did the deep dive. So I watched stuff you did, Voya did, Kit did, anybody who was reviewing e-ink at the time. I was like all over it. And of course, I ended up on the Supernote, but that was just where I landed based on what I needed to be digital. But every video you did, even after I'd made my decision, I love that kind of content. I love to see how people are using things and how they work them into their flow. So hopefully at some point you'll be able to get back to doing a little bit more content. But you're right. It's always hard. I mean, this, even what we're doing right now, is a hobby for me. This is not a full-time job. I don't think most creators on YouTube make enough money from ad revenue and other things to be self-sustaining.
No, I mean, just to put things into perspective, like, I had a relatively successful YouTube channel, but it's still not a high leverage usage of my time. Like, if the goal is to make money, YouTube is not usually the answer for most people. Like, just, you do it because you love it. You do it because you love the discussion and the discourse and how it brings like-minded people out of the woodwork, and you can have really nerdy conversations about the thing that you're passionate about, which I think is the rewarding part. It's not financially lucrative, even if you have some moderate degree of success.
We've talked about how you kind of onboard someone with playlist and have that personal conversation. Could you describe a time maybe where you're talking to somebody, you're having the conversation, and it's just not the right fit for them? Has that happened yet? I mean, I know you're onboarding slowly and, kind of maybe walk us through what the process of signing up is a little bit too. But I'm kind of curious, has there been the conversation where someone's like describing how they want to approach all of this and you're like, no, this really isn't the
Yeah.
right thing for you?
So, yes, I think part of the reason for the onboarding is there's a lot of complexity to this. Like, at the surface, you could use it like any other planning tool. But I think if you're just going to try and shoehorn the way you've done things in the past into this, you're going to be disappointed. So, like, if your goal is to see all of your tasks for all of eternity, Playlist is hiding that from you intentionally, because instead of like having this debt mindset of all the things that we're not going to get to, we want you to commit to just the things that you're going to get to this week so that you don't feel that burden that you're not doing enough. And so if you feel like you need to constantly see everything on your list for all of eternity, playlist is going to be frustrating for you. But that's an intentional choice that we've taken. And so, like, what I've actually found is people who are like long-term GTDers who have been using like those tools for many, many years, they have strong embedded habits of like how they want to interact with their tasks. And they're not ready to shift that. And that's perfectly fine. But like we want to learn that ahead of time. I talked a little bit about like people in sales who like need to be on call, and like being on call is like a function of success for what they're doing. Also, not a great fit for this. That's not the goal. And the other piece is this shift to a weekly cadence. And so I chat with a lot of people who one of the first questions that gets asked in that conversation is, well, when do you plan your week? And the conversation is sometimes each morning. The conversation is sometimes, I don't know. And that's part of the like change piece of playlists, is this idea that on any given day, your day can get derailed. A friend can come into town and you have to decide between continuing to do the thing that you set out to do today or meeting up with a friend you haven't seen in years. And I don't want to create a scenario where you feel this like burden that you can't go do that spontaneous thing because of the plan you set out for yourself. Or your boss reaches out to you with some actually mission critical thing that requires a pivot of like what you were going to do. And so like any day can get wrecked. It's very rare that an entire week goes completely off the rails without us like not showing up. And so the goal is, how can I show up on any given week and like have success? So that starts with setting a day of the week that you're going to plan your week, and holding time for doing that planning, going through your inbox, figuring out what's important for this week, what's strategic, committing to what am I actually going to intend to get done, and what do I know I'm realistically not going to get to, and shifting that out. And so if people can't commit to that, then playlist isn't a great fit. So like there's almost this commitment that like I want to have some change, I want to have some shift in how I think and how I approach my week, versus this is just a new software tool that I'm going to try and do a minor tweak to what I've always done. This is going to kind of challenge you to think a little bit differently about it, because if you're just going to try and do the same thing you've already done, you're not going to see like markedly different outcomes. This is a bit higher order thinking than that.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting way to go at it, because I think a lot of the times we think the tool will fix the problem, or even a perceived problem. Like you said, this idea of thinking through the why and the reasoning, because in full transparency, I'm not the greatest person at sitting down on a specific day and planning out my week and mapping it out. I'm not good at that. Again, I know that about myself, and I would like to get better at that. My lovely and very intelligent wife is very much the opposite. She'll sit down and map out her week, and
Hmm.
she still does it old school and does it on paper, and that's great. It works for her, and it works very well for her. I'm not that person. I'd like to be able to be that way and be effective. But then there's also the other extreme of that. Some people spend all their time making lists and don't end up getting anything done.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's like, how do you find that balance? And from what I'm hearing you saying about playlist and my brief interactions with it, it seems to help find a balance of planning, but also making sure you stick to the plan and know when to pivot, or when to maybe even just change it up a little bit. And as someone and you've been in startups and I've been doing change management for decades at this point, but things are going to change, but you have to be able cognitively to allow that in and allow that to happen. And so I appreciate that explanation of, if you're that person who's always been to-do list driven, to where these are my tasks and these are the 500 things I need to get done, that's going to make this process a little harder. Not impossible, I don't think by any stretch, but maybe impossible in the short term. You have to really say, I want to change something. I want to do something differently.
Well, speaking to your scenario, I was never a planner. Like that's not how I'm wired. But I realized that if I wanted to be creative, creativity is chaotic. And so in order to enable that chaos, I needed a little bit of order. And so, like you said, it's difficult to like show up to plan your week. And unless you like make a commitment and you like build up that discipline, like it doesn't happen organically. So Playlist is trying to take some of the willpower piece out of that by like nudging you to do the thing that you know you should do, but in the moment don't necessarily want to do. And so it's kind of a partner with you, kind of pushing you. Like there's kind of two pieces to this. There's like strategic ed, who knows that they should plan. And then there's like in the moment ed that's like, or we can change ed. Like Brandon is the same way.
No, you.
Like strategic Brandon knows that we need to like plan our week this morning. There are loads of things I would rather do. And so the fact that Playlist is nudging me to do that, and like that is like the one bit of debt that like Playlist will kind of masquerade in front of you is like, hey, we haven't planned our week yet. Like we should do that. Doesn't have to be like huge. We just need to pick 1 to 3 things that are in our control that are strategic that we intend to do this week. And nothing more, nothing less. That's the minimum. And if we do that, the rest will fall into place. We don't have to plan every minute. We just need to plan those big rocks. We got to set the big rocks. We got to decide when we think we're going to get to them realistically based on the meetings and other commitments within our week. Like if we look at our week and our high energy time is filled with meetings, probably need to lower our expectations of how much like legitimate output we're going to get done. But if you have a habit or a ritual, if you will, where you actually like look at the week and you go, nope, we're not going to get much done this week. Then at the end of the week, when that occurs, you're not surprised. You're not feeling down or like you failed to show up. And so I think it's setting some realistic expectations about what the week's going to look like and not overburdening ourselves when realistically we were never going to get to that to begin with. So you don't have this shame or this dread. You kind of knew what was going to happen before it happened.
And don't feel bad about calling on chaotic ed, because trust me, he wins far more than I would like him to. Because, I mean, before I ever went into academics or anything, I was in retail for 20 years. And anyone who's ever worked in the service industry, and you mentioned sales, it's chaotic from the minute you hit the door to the minute you leave. I always admired the people most who could structure their day and be able to get everything done, because it was so difficult with all of the bombarding things from a customer service perspective or someone falling or safety perspective. I mean, there's just so many chaotic things happening. And I find that that's both what's helped make me successful in change leadership in other contexts, but also has caused problems in other contexts because of the fact that when you have to be in the moment all the time, or it feels like it, versus when you have the time and space to be able to slow down or be able to have that pre-planning component to what you're doing, I think it makes all the difference. So yeah, don't never feel bad about it. I am so many times that person who says, okay, I could take 30 minutes now and plan this out. Now, don't get me wrong, I do that a lot. If someone gives me a huge project, the first thing I do is I start putting up buckets. You know, here are
You're going to break it down.
flow chart of all of the things that are going to have to happen. The task management piece is where I feel I break down. You know, I'm very good at that big picture planning because I enjoy it. I love the conceptual stuff. I love to be able to sit down and say, okay, these 20 systems have to integrate with this new thing we're going to do. And here they all are. And here are the people who need to be involved. I'm not great at sitting down and saying, okay, here's what each one of those people may need to do until I get there. And then it's like, okay, have you thought about ABC? But those are conversations. I'm not good at capturing it way ahead of time. So
this brings up another strong opinion that I have. So a lot of tools have this concept of subtasks, and Playlist does not have subtasks. And so I had a conversation with a guy this past week, and he was like, I really need subtasks. And I kind of blankly looked at him and I was like, do you? And so the problem with this is you'll have some deliverable and you'll put that as like your main thing for the week, or you'll put that as your your from 9 to 11 block on Tuesday. And the thing is, if you have subtasks, you will block that whole thing from 9 to 11, and you'll think that you can finish that task from 9 to 11. But then if you actually break the task down into its atomic parts, you'll realize, okay, actually, part of this is me doing the work. And then part of this is me reaching out to someone else for feedback. And then part of this is getting a sign off from someone else. And if you're forced to break it down into its individual pieces, you'll realize you can't actually complete that thing between 9 and 11. You can complete the first part between 9 to 11. You're going to have to wait till tomorrow morning to get feedback from so-and-so. And you're going to have to wait until Friday to get sign off from someone else. And so by forcing you to make them individual tasks, you'll realize that this task is actually going to take you until Friday to finish, even though you feel like you can put it on your calendar from 9 to 11 today. And so by forcing you to break them down to their individual pieces, you can move them around your calendar, and you can set yourself little reminders to follow up with people instead of them all being packaged together and you're just constantly moving the same thing around to a bunch of different spaces. It's like you have to resist that urge. Like your natural reaction is like, oh yeah, I can totally get that done. It's like, no, you can't. And it's not even your fault. You just didn't realize because your tool enabled you to do this bad thing.
Well, and I would take it a step further, and I think this is why you and I may have the same strong opinion on this to a point. I think the tools oftentimes encourage us to think the way you just outlined. And partially, I always say that the consumer is just as responsible for the behavior of the company as the company is. And I think that's true because every time I hear someone or one of my students say, oh, well, this company did this. Well, they're filling a need. Do you not want that? And I like the fact that you took a beat with that individual and were like, do you need a subtask? Because the default, I noticed this happen with Microsoft Planner. They instituted subtasks within tasks. And at first I thought, do I need that? And then I started to use it and then I realized it starts to suck up your day. It starts to, it basically, yes, you need to think about those things, but do they all fit where you're placing them? And it's almost like a artificial constraint on the overarching thing you want to get done. Like you said, it's like, I know I want to get this big thing done. Well, is it a task then? Or is it, when do you go from this is a goal versus a task? And I know that's a much, more ethereal philosophical question, but I think it's important for people to understand that those are two totally different things. At least in my way of thinking. The goal is your destination. The tasks are kind of the journey points, the waypoints along the way.
Oh, I have another strong opinion.
Good.
We're pulling out all of my strong. We have all of my strong opinions. I think goals are a great tool. I think they're not always the right tool. I think we reach to goals far too often. I'll tell sort of a personal story. My mother, growing up, she would always be dieting. And so she'd set a goal that she was going to lose some amount of weight. And so that would be the goal. And then she would reach her goal and she would revert back to her previous habits. And then she would gain the weight. And then she would set a new goal to diet. And because she never actually set a standard of how she was going to operate, she was constantly on this always on, always off. And so I think one of the challenges with goals is, what do you do once you reach them? And so I've found with a lot of very fulfilling projects, I find it much better to set a standard or an expectation for myself. Like I mentioned this earlier in the call, when I started my YouTube channel, there was no goal to get to X number of subscribers. Because once you get to that, then what? Instead, I set a standard of I'm going to put a video out every 2 weeks. And as long as I do that for a long enough period of time, good things will happen. And it's once I get to the end of the 2 weeks, we just go again. And so I've just found that stick-to-itiveness is far more rewarding and leads to cool things that otherwise we would stop when we get to the goal because we've exhausted ourselves because the goal was too strenuous and not sustainable in the long term. So how do we create sustainable growth or sustainable momentum that we can continue for long periods.
I I agree wholeheartedly, and as someone who struggled with weight myself for years, I that was kind of my default was I would lose a bunch of weight and then I would gain it back, and then I started to slowly change my habits.
Hmm.
And part of that was forced because I became diabetic but now everything's under control. I pretty much, I've changed the way that I approach things and I feel better because I realize it's a process. It's not an endpoint. A lot of the time we get forced into, or we force ourselves, I think even more so, into thinking that this is exactly what I want success to look like versus realizing that success takes many forms. And just because you finished project A doesn't mean that that's the end. There could be something really cool that shoots off of that. And then now there's this new thing you're doing, but you're still building on those other layered successes or those many cases, in my case at least, not so successes where you learn as much from hitting the wall and not being successful, but that informs the next thing that you go on to do.
So that reflection, I think, is another piece that's really important, and I think something we don't naturally do. So like that's one other aspect of playlist. It's this plan, do, reflect cycle, and again, that all happens in the week. So at the beginning of the week, you plan your week. During the week, you're trying to execute or operate at a high level. And then at the end of the week, we reflect and we realize, hey, we did some really cool things, and you can carry that momentum. And so like in my startups, like that was always the thing. Is like we had this thing we were trying to get to. And then the second we got to that thing, we'd move on to the next thing. And you're making tons and tons of progress and never actually like seeing or celebrating the progress. And so like when you're in a company, that's okay because you bounce ideas off people and like you get that feeling of success and accomplishment. But when you're working on something alone, like a YouTube channel or a book, no one's often there to help you celebrate. And so we have to build that habit in, or else we'll kind of stutter out or sputter out rather and lose momentum and stop doing it. And so just trying to make that part of the cycle as well, because we actually are accomplishing a lot. We just don't see the progress we're making oftentimes.
Yeah, and I have two last things because I do want to be respectful of your time today, but I have two last questions and they're branches off of some things you talked about. So one is what you just said about as far as, sometimes we don't have the specific context. One thing that I really value in the way I've heard you describe playlist before is the idea that this is about you as a person. It's not about your work context only. It's about the idea that you have different, varying energy levels during the day. You have various tasks that may be personal, may be work related. But this idea, and I've thought about this for a long time, that really we have a lot of trouble as human beings separating all of that out, but we try very hard to do that. So the idea that I'm this person at work versus I'm this person at home, not recognizing that those two people still exist
Hmm.
at the same time. And so I'm curious, is that part of the thought process as you were going through and building this system, recognizing that, work Brandon and home Brandon have some similarities and commonalities. They're not going to act exactly the same, but I can't say that these are two separate things.
Yeah, and I think like if we were to like boil down everything we've talked about in this conversation, it's all about sustainability. And so like there are times where work needs more of our energy. And there are times where like family needs our energy. And so it's about figuring out what is sustainable long term. And we've talked a lot about in this conversation about this feedback loop, if you will. I think it's very easy to fall trap to well, work needs me because I'm trying to get this promotion. And then short term family suffers. And like you can do that for small periods of time as long as there's confidence that the balance will shift back at some point. But if you don't do that for long enough periods of time, you'll either burn out, you'll have trouble at home. And so you have to figure out what that mix is. And like you mentioned in your doctorate, like this you need this commitment that we're all signing up for this thing or else you're going to run into trouble. So I think it's just giving you that loop. I think one of the subtle little things in playlist is your tasks and your events are color coded. And so you can see at a glance, like, all right, what is my mix of work and family and side project? And is that healthy and is that sustainable? On a weekly basis, you can try and shift the balance back into play. So that mix is different for different people and it's different at different points in your life. It's just figuring out what feels right and calibrating, does how I think I'm using my time align with how I'm actually using my time? And does that align with my goals?
I just love the idea that you encourage people to look at it from that perspective of here's me as a person and I need to figure out what my balance is. I really like the way that that's done. So the last thing I'm going to ask you before I ask you to just tell everybody where they can find playlist, how do you think, and this may give us a little bit of a conversation starter, AI is
Mm.
everywhere. So
Hmm.
artificial intelligence is everywhere. And playlist to me feels like it's very intentional and personalized, and it's about you making decisions.
Hmm.
With the influx of AI tools, which are highly validating and very much wanting to make you feel good about yourself versus pushing you to be reflective in some cases. Not saying it's all bad. I mean, my thoughts on this have been out there for a while, but do you see, as someone who does really work in the focus planning stage of creativity, how do you view that? And is that something that can either be helpful in being able to stay organized and on task and planning, or can it turn into its own kind of distraction? Is there some kind of middle ground? I'm just curious your thoughts because I see it infused in every single tool I use now. And sometimes, yeah, it's marginally helpful. Sometimes it's very helpful. Sometimes it causes me more work than if I'd have just done the thing. So I'm curious as to your perspective on that.
I guess let me start by saying I am not anti AI. I think there are whole areas of things that have been streamlined and optimized through AI. So I think AI can be a great tool. I don't think it's a replacement or even at this point augmentation for something like playlist because I'll give you an example. We talked about like the different mindsets. We talked about the planning mindset versus the doing mindset. And although we could take AI and automate the planning side of playlist, the problem is going to happen when you get to the doing mindset and you weren't the person who decided that this was the thing we're going to be doing right now. And so, like, although we could automate all that, the likelihood of you actually showing up and doing the thing that you weren't a participant in planning means you're way less likely to actually accomplish the thing that you set out for this time. And so you being the person or you being the thing that decided this is the thing we're going to work on at this period of time is an important part in the commitment of actually seeing it through. We lose so much value in the follow-up if we just augment that with AI. And so for now, Playlist is not implementing AI. Like you can still use AI for the actual doing part if that's appropriate, but not infusing that. And so I'm not ruling out that we won't do it. Like I think there's some really cool aspects of it. So like one of the ideas I've had for a long time with AI is when you set a task as your focus for the week. My goal with any focus task is it's something that should be able to be accomplished in a single focus session. So shouldn't take more than maybe 90 minutes to complete. Something starts to take more than 90 minutes, your likelihood of getting it done in this session like drop significantly. And so I think a really cool use of AI is if you put a task as your focus task and then slot it into your calendar, and AI can figure out that that's going to take way more than 90 minutes to help you break that down into like smaller chunks that can be done in 90 minutes. So like I think that's a really interesting thing of like, hey, you're kind of unintentionally perhaps setting yourself up for failure. Or another one is when you're in like the focus view and you're about to start working on something, maybe there's like a help me get started button that takes the task and like helps you like break down like what you should maybe start for the first 5 minutes to help you like get through that initial getting started friction. But as far as like the actual like organization of your life, I don't think you want to automate that. I think you need to be an active participant in that process or else like what are we even doing here?
Yeah, I mean, and the reason I asked this question is it's so interesting. On Patreon for my subscribers, I co-wrote a reflection on my YouTube watch history for 1 month with with Gemini. So
Hmm.
I had it review the entire what I had watched for 30 days and summarize it, and then I went in and I augmented all of that. And what I noticed in that was what it chose, it did a decent job in summarizing, but it had no clue what I really enjoyed. And so it
Hmm.
lost the nuance because, to your point, what are we doing? Because, like, I love Cam Shan's videos, but Cam doesn't put out a video as regularly as Kit does or as MKBHD does, or, so it focused on frequency instead of looking at the totality and kind of looking at
Hmm.
interests. So it was an interesting experiment. And then I tried to have it help me write a blog and it just couldn't. And I shared both of those. I said, I started this blog with some generated content and I scrapped pretty much all of it because it couldn't capture voice. So I'm wondering, and I think you answered that, was if it doesn't know you, which it can't because it's looking at frequencies.
Yeah, that's a deep level of context to understand, like, your id and your subconscious that maybe even we don't fully understand at all times.
I'm glad it's not a replacement for playlist. And and quite frankly, I think to your point, it can be, and I've seen it be a very useful tool in specific things, especially in the education space. But I've also seen where it can be extremely harmful if someone doesn't know what it's actually doing versus what it's being marketed as. So I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic. But back to playlist, and we're gonna close out here. But tell people how they can get started. Kind of describe where you're at as far as implementing this because it's officially rolled out, and tell them how they can reach out, how they can contact you, how they can get on the list, and the nuts and bolts of how to get started.
Yeah. So would love you to take a look at it. It's at playlist.day. I'll put a link down in the bottom. Right now we're doing manual onboarding. I guess something we didn't talk about, Ed, is this is sort of my baby and I'm handling all aspects of it. So did all the design, the philosophy, the development, customer support. And so I can't just open the floodgates and let everyone in. I think there's currently like 2,000 people on the wait list. But if you go to playlist.day, you can join the wait list, and I'm letting in about 10 people each week, making sure everyone's having a great experience, people aren't running into bugs. And then as we do more and more of that, we'll open it up to more and more people. Like I mentioned, currently we're just letting people in on the Mac. Historically, it's been people on the Mac and on Google Calendar. This week, we actually launched support for native Apple Calendar support. So those who use iCal or Apple Calendar or anything that the Mac OS can connect to. So that opens up another group of people. We'll start sending out invites for that. But yeah, take a look at it at playlist.day. Would love for you to join and would love to chat with you soon. So getting people in as quickly as I can while doing it sustainably and making sure everyone has a great experience.
Yeah, that's amazing that you're a one-man show doing all of that. Everyone that I've heard who has used it, and like I said, I saw early models of it, and I was very impressed with the way it works. But everyone I've heard has had nothing but good things to say about it. So
Everyone is far too
congratulations.
kind.
Well, I mean, congratulations on that level of success. It's hard when you spend so much time on something and then maybe somebody doesn't like it. You can't help but take that a little personally. And so it's nice to know that it is being well received. And I can't wait till it, as I told you earlier, comes to Windows. One last question on that. Is there a web interface, or do you primarily say you should really use it on a desktop environment?
Yeah, so there is a web version of the app. Right now, we're focusing specifically for the native versions of the app because one of the really, I think, useful aspects of Playlist is this ability to create a task from anywhere. So this idea that I'm in a meeting or I'm working on something else and something procs in my mind, and I feel like I just need to get it off of my brain. And so this idea that you can press a single set of keys, add the task, press enter, it'll add it to playlists, and I never have to leave what I was doing. I could stay in my browser, I could stay on my Zoom call and like scratch that itch of knowing that I'll get back to that thing. And so when you're on the web, you can kind of do it, but it's not quite the same. And also this ability to like have your focus task always show in the status bar for your machine so that you can never fully lose sight of the thing that you're really trying to get done. And also the ability to see your upcoming meetings and to be able to launch into those with a single click or keystroke is also really nice. So focusing on that for now. There are people who can use it on the web, but trying to get to the people who will have the best experience first, and then we'll open it up to more people.
Well, that's great. And Brandon, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here today. Always a pleasure to catch up with you and to learn more about this and about the journey and about how this is affecting people. It's just been a pleasure having you on. And we will drop links to all of this down in the description. So you'll have links to the website, how to get started. And until next time, we will talk to you all later. So just keep moving forward and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Appreciate it.